Thank you. So the theme of this conference is about the world of opportunities. And I'd like to share with you a little story about two kinds of opportunities. The first is indeed about the opportunity that's been provided to people around the world over the last 20 years to provide hope for people who otherwise didn't have the hope of long and healthy lives. And the second is the opportunity that effort provided me when I decided to join it for a career and a path over the last 20 years that changed my life in ways I couldn't have anticipated when I faced the decision of whether to join that group or not. It's a story of a quiet revolution that has swept the healthcare and pharmaceutical worlds over the last 20 years. And most of you probably are unaware of it, unless you've been personally involved with one of the patients who's benefited from it, in which case you're probably intimately familiar with it. Because it is indeed the story of the pursuit, the quest to find cures for rare genetic diseases, often called orphan diseases. And they're called orphan diseases for two reasons. The first is that they're rare, that typically understood to be diseases which afflict fewer than about 200,000 people in the United States, or about the same number in Europe, or comparable numbers on a per capita basis around the world. But the second is because they've been neglected by the healthcare system and the pharmaceutical industry, because they weren't seen as profitable. So 30 years ago, patients with these diseases had no hope, because the pharmaceutical industry pursued a certain model, which was highly profitable, sometimes called the blockbuster model. And that was a model that basically said if you could sell very similar kinds of pills, one after another, to people with very widespread diseases, even if the next generation didn't provide that much more real health benefit than the last generation, you could make a lot of money doing it. And as a result, these diseases, which are individually very complex, which required new technologies to pursue, which were high risk in terms of the probability of success, and which would take developing a different drug, a different therapy for each disease, they weren't interested. Now, some of these diseases you might have heard of, the more prevalent of these rare diseases, have names like cystic fibrosis and muscular dystrophy and type 1 diabetes, and they impact maybe 100,000 or more people in the United States and a comparable number in Europe. But there are actually, it turns out, hundreds, even thousands of these rare genetic diseases. And many of them afflict only a few thousand people around the world, and many of them a few hundred people around the world. And most of those, again, unless you had the experience perhaps in your own family with one of these, you've probably never heard of. And they include diseases with names like Geraghty disease, Fabry disease, Pompe disease, Niemann-Pick disease, many others typically named as those names suggest by the physicians who first diagnosed them, maybe 100 or more years ago in most cases, but for which there were little therapy available and very little effort being put in by anybody to develop those therapies. And as a result, patients and families who really had no hope other than seeing the disease take its natural course, usually of lifetime disability and early death. That started to change about 30 years ago, in 1983. And that's why this is kind of a 30th anniversary of the beginning of this quest. And that reflects two things that happened in 1983, one of which is widely recognized and being celebrated in some ways around the world this year. And that was the passage of some legislation called the Orphan Drug Legislation, Orphan Drug Acts, first in the United States and a little later in Europe and then in many other countries, that recognized that there was this tremendous societal problem that had no solution and tried to provide certain incentives to encourage people to begin to work and try to solve these problems. Didn't really make them attractive, but tried to remove some of the impediments. And that was important. It definitely had an impact. But also 30 years ago, something else happened, which was less noted at the time, which I think in many ways really marked the beginning of this quiet revolution. And that was that one child was treated, one boy, a boy named Brian, who had one of these ultra-orphan diseases, a disease called Geraghty disease. And he was treated by a physician at the National Institutes of Health in Geraghty, who had been studying this disease already for 20 years and had understood a lot of the science and thought he had identified the ingredient, the enzyme that was deficient in this disease that needed to be administered to cure the disease. And you see here on the left, the boy, Brian Berman, you see that grossly distended abdomen, which is a characteristic symptom of this disease, a very grossly enlarged liver and spleen, which are otherwise untreatable, and normally led to severe disability and early death. And Dr. Brady was trying to get this trial started at the NIH, and Brian Berlin's mother heard about it. And she was desperate to get her child enrolled. But he wasn't allowed to be in, because when people are doing trials, the young children are typically, because of possible safety risks, not allowed in. But Brian's mother wouldn't take no for an answer, because she had studied the disease, and she understood that without treatment, her son was facing a relatively imminent death. It turned out she was pregnant with her second child, and anticipated that he might also have this disease, was desperate to find some hope. So she quit her job, and she started campaigning full-time at the NIH and the FDA to get her child in this trial. And finally, after months of effort and pleading, a special exception was made. And then a second remarkable thing happened with Brian in this trial, which was that as the trial began, none of the other patients in the trial responded. It looked like the drug wasn't working. There was no benefit. And then Brian was treated. And Brian responded miraculously. His belly returned to normal size, and all of the other symptoms associated with the disease disappeared. And the drug was in very scarce supply, and so it turned out, not by design but of necessity, when Dr. Brady and the investigators ran out of drug, his belly would extend again. When they were able to get the enzyme purified and administered again, they could see that he was being cured again. And so it turned out that Dr. Brady, much as he learned about this drug, hadn't really known what the dose was. And the dose that he had been planning to use wasn't sufficient to treat the other patients. And if Brian hadn't been enrolled in the trial, no one ever would have realized that the drug would work. So that saved the whole trial and began the beginning of the realization that this therapy could work. It was an amazing victory. You see here Brian over the last 28 years, now 30 years, now a young man with a family, wife and children of his own, healthy, productive, employed, contributing to society. It's a beautiful story, and it really marked the beginning of the whole development of that drug. But that was just one child, and one, in some ways, still the beginning of the story. Because even Dr. Brady and the NIH, as talented and dedicated as they were, they couldn't develop drugs. Only a company is organized in such a way to do all of the investment in clinical trials, manufacturing, regulatory processes, distribution, to actually get a drug approved and available to the patients who need it. So Henry Tremere was asked to join a company which was getting organized. And a lot of people at the time told me he was crazy. There were only thought to be 200 patients with Gaucher disease in the world. People said, you can't possibly build a company on this. No way that this company can ever make money. But Henry believed that the drug had been proven to work, and that he had a responsibility, and we as a society had a responsibility, to find a way to develop it and make it available to these patients. And Henry asked me to join him, and I told him he was crazy, and it wasn't going to make any sense. But he did anyway, and he started a company which then put in years of effort in clinical trials, manufacturing, research, all the other things that needed to be done, and proved that it worked. And got approved by the FDA and ultimately became the basis for building the company successfully. And about that time, I joined. The company was a little further along, but still very high risk. People still thought there were only a few hundred patients. And I was at the time working in a company where I was making a good income, and I had a very satisfying job, but it was all about making money in the company that I worked with. Henry managed to communicate this sense of a mission. He felt he had a mission, and he wanted people who were willing to join him in this mission to take this therapy to all the patients around the world. So I did decide to join. And it turned out, over the years, that there weren't 200 patients with this disease, there were 5,000. And they were all around the world. And this is a picture of one of my colleagues with a young girl in Peru, who mother learned that she had the disease, found the company in Boston, found the enzyme. We went down and connected with her and got her on therapy. I myself represented the company here in Europe and in places around the world like China and India. And I had the incredible privilege of meeting families, patients, and parents. A girl in India, I'll tell you a story about, named Nidhi, who was 8 years old, who was the first child, the first person in India ever diagnosed with another rare genetic disease called Pompe disease, which was uniformly fatal at that point by the early teens. And Nidhi was 8 years old and she was already on a respirator. And I went to visit her with somebody else from India in a one-room apartment her whole family had moved to be near the only medical center in India that had any chance of being able to provide this therapy. And she was on a respirator. And I went to see her expecting to hear about this tragic life, this very poor family, this 8-year-old child, and only child on a respirator. Instead, what I heard was their incredible gratitude that somebody had found them and given their daughter the opportunity to give this therapy, and to get the possibility of actually getting off it, as she ultimately did, and returning to a healthy life. And all they wanted to talk about was what could they do to help make sure that all the other children in need who were suffering from this disease could be identified and diagnosed even younger in need, so that they could get on this therapy earlier and live truly healthy and full lives. And those kinds of stories are so inspiring that they motivated me and other people in the company to do whatever it took to see that we could find all the patients who needed this. That drug and that company ultimately became very successful, and as that was developing, people started to realize around the world that it wasn't just a few drugs that this one company could develop, but actually that scientists and physicians around the world were discovering new approaches every day to treat many of these other hundreds of rare diseases. And you see here logos of some of the many different companies, academic institutions, medical centers, government agencies, patient organizations, increasingly patients themselves organizing to identify these diseases, conduct the research, lead the effort to get these products developed and approved. It's been an amazing success story. Today, 30 years later, 2,700 products have been designated under the provisions of this Orphan Drug Act as orphan drugs, and 400 of them have been approved. It's been an amazing success. But that success raises its own challenges. And some people say the mission is achieved, but actually the mission is really just beginning in the full range of what it needs to achieve, because some people say we can't afford to develop therapies for these other diseases. They're too expensive. Because of the small number of patients involved, these often are one of the most expensive drugs in the world. But the question is, are we prepared to accept that as an answer? And I think the answer is no. But we can't just do it the way we've done it the last 30 years. So I think the opportunity on one hand is to find new ways of working in this area, to find new kinds of business models, new ways of innovating, new ways of collaborating, ways to do this more effectively, more cost effectively, and ensure that we don't allow these obstacles to prevent these other diseases or these other therapies which are being discovered every day from going forward. And more generally, I think it sends the message that when an opportunity comes, even if you think you're someplace which is safe and comfortable, and even if you think you're doing something that seems secure and something else seems like it's potentially very high risk and you're not sure it's going to work, but if there are people involved in it who are passionate and motivated and who see that they have a mission, and if you see that that's a mission that can be actually something that can be really rewarding to you and that you can be confident can make a contribution to society, that can be a mission worth joining and something that can provide opportunities for you. And whatever field it is, can provide hope to people who need it. This happens to be a case where that's being provided to patients and children, in many cases, and their families, who didn't have hope before this company and now other companies like it have taken on the cause of trying to see that these things were brought to fruition. But I think more broadly, whether you choose to get involved in this specific area or not, I think the idea that opportunities like this are present not only for patients like this, but for the people who choose to join in them. And that journey of joining in those efforts can be so powerful and so enriching on a personal level, that it's the kind of thing that when it comes along, it's worth seriously considering. Thank you very much.